There is a certain church in the city of New York which I have always regarded with peculiar interest. On account of a marriage there is solemnized under very singular circumstances. In my grandmother's girlhood, that venerable lady chanced to be a spectator of the scene, and even after made it her favorite narrative. Whether the edifice now standing on the same site be the identical one with which she referred, I am not antiquarian enough to know, nor would it be worth it while to correct myself, perhaps of agreeable error, by reading the date of erection of the tablet over the door. It is a stately church, surrounded by an enclosure of the loveliest green, within which appear urns, pillars, obelisks, and other form of monumental marble. The tributes of private affection, or more splendid memorials of historic dust, which are placed, though the tumult of the city rolls beneath its tower. One would be willing to connect some legitimate interests. The marriage might be considered as the result of an early engagement, though there had been 2 intermediate weddings on the lady's part, and 40 years of celibacy on that of the gentleman. At 6 Mr. Elwood was a shy, but not quite slandered man, selfish, like all men who brood over their own hearts, yet manifest on rare occasion is vain of generous sentiment. A scholar throughout life, though always the indolent one, because his study had no definite object, either of public advantage or personal ambition, a gentleman, high-bred and fastidiously delicate, yet sometimes requires a considerable relaxation, in his behalf, of the common rules of society. In truth, there were so many anomalies in his character, and though shrinking with diseased sensibility from public notice, it had been his fatality so often to become the topic of the day, by some wild eccentricity of conduct, that people search his lineage for an hereditary trait of insanity. But there was no need of this. His caprice had their origin in mind that lacked and so forth the engrossing purpose, and in feeling that preyed upon themselves for what of other food. If he were mad, it was the consequence, and not the cause, of the aimless and abortive life. The widow was as complete a contrast to her third bridegroom, in everything but age, as can well be conceived. Compelled to relinquish her first engagement, she had been united to a man of twice her own years, to whom she became an exemplary wife, and by whose death she was left a possession of a splendid fortune. A southern gentleman, considerably younger than herself, succeeded to her hand, and carried her to Charleston, where, after upon unforgettable years, she found herself again a widow. It would have been a singular, in many uncommon delicacy of feeling had survived through such a life of Mrs. Badness. It could not but be rushed and killed by her early disappointment. The cold duty of her first marriage, the dislocation of the heart's principle, consequence on a second union, and the unkindness of her southern husband, which has inevitably driven her to connect the idea of this death with that of her comfort. To be brief, she was the wisest but unloveliest variety of human. A philosopher, bearing troubles of heart and equanimity, dispensing with all that should have been her happiness, and make the best of what remained. Sage is the most martyr. The widow was perhaps the more amiable for the fertility that made her ridiculous. Being childless, she could not remind the beautiful babe proxy in the person of a daughter. She therefore refused to grow old and ugly on any consideration, struggled with the time, and held fast her roses in spite of him, till the venerable drift appeared to have relinquished the spoil, as not worth the trouble of acquiring it. The approaching marriage of this woman of the world with such an unworldly man as Mr. Elwood was announced soon after Mrs. Badney's return to her native city. Superficial observance, and the first one, seemed to concur in supposing that the lady must have borne no inactive part arranging the affair. There were considerations of expediency which she would be far more likely to appreciate than Mr. Elwood. And there was just a specious pantheon of the sentiment and romance in this late union of two early lovers, which sometimes make a fool of woman who has lost her true feelings among the accidents of life. All the wonder was, how the gentleman, with his lack of worldly wisdom and his consciousness of ridicule, could have been induced to take a measure at once so prudent and so laudable. But while people talked, the wedding day arrived. The ceremony was to be solemnized according to the Episcopalian form, and in open church, with a degree of publicity that attract many spectators who occupied the front seats of the galleries and the pews near the custom of the day, and the partless should proceed separately to church. By some accident, and bridegroom was a little less punctual than the widow and her bridal attendants, with whose arrival, after this tedious but necessary preface, the action of our tale may be said to commence. The clumsy wheels of several old-fashioned coaches were heard, and the gentlemen and ladies composing the bridal party came through the church door with the sudden gladsome effect of a burst of sunshine. The whole group, except the principal figure, was made of the youth and gaiety. As they streamed up the broad aisle, while the posts and the pillars seemed to brighten on the other side, their steps were as buoyant as if they mistook the church of all ballroom, and were ready to dance, hand to hand to the altar. So brilliant was the spectacle that few took notice of a singular phenomenon that had marked its entrance. At the moment when the bride's foot touched the threshold, the bell swung heavenly in the tower above her, and set forth deepest knell. The vibration died away and returned with prolonged solemnity. As she entered the body of the church, "God heavens, what an omen!" whispered a young lady to her lover. "Oh, my honor," replied the gentleman, "I believe the bell was the good taste to toll of its own accord. What has she to do with weddings? If you, dearest Julia, were approaching the altar, the bell would ring it on its merriest peal. It has only one funeral knell for her." The bride and the most of her company had been too much occupied with the bustle of entrance to hear the first bounding stroke of the bell, or at least reflect on the singularity of which welcome to the altar. They therefore continued to advance with an diminished gaiety. The gorgeous dresses of the time, the crimson velvet coats, the gold lace hats, the hoop petticoats, the silk, satin, brocade, and the embroidery, the buckles, canes, and the swords, all displayed to the best advantage on persons suited to such finery, made the group appear more like brighter colored picture than anything real. But by what perversity of taste had the artist represented his principal figure as so wrinkled and decayed, while yet he had decked her out in the brightest splendor of attire, as if the loveliest maiden had suddenly withered into age, and become a moral to the beautiful around her. On they went, however, had glittered along about the third of the aisle, when another stroke of the spell seemed to fill to the church and visible gloom, dimming and obscuring the bright pageant, till it shone forth again as from the mist. This time the party wavered, stopped, and huddled closer together, while a slight scream was heard from some of the ladies, and a confused whispering among the gentlemen. Thus, tossing to and fro, they might have been fasciculated compared to a splendid bunch of flowers, suddenly shaken by a puff of wind which threatened to scatter the leaves of an old, brown, withered rose on the same stalk with two dewy buds, such being the emblems of the widow between her fair young bridesmaids. But her heroism was admirable. She had started with the irresistible shudder, as if the stroke of the bell had fallen directly on her heart. Then, recovering herself while her attendants were yet is dismayed, she took the lead and paced calmly up the aisle. The bell continued to swing, strike, and vibrate with the same doleful regularity as when a corpse is on its way to be tombed. "My young friends here have their nerves a little shaken," said the widow, with a smile to the clergyman of the altar. "But so many weddings has been unshirted in the merest peals of bell, yet it turned unhappily, that I shall hope for better fortune under such different auspices." "Madam," answered the rector in great perplexity, "this strange occurrence brings to my mind a marriage sermon of the famous Bishop Taylor, wherein he mingled so many thoughts of morality and future woe, that to speak somewhat after his own rich style, he seems to hang the bridal chamber in black, and cut the wedding garment out of coffin pall, and it has been the costume of divers nations to infuse something of sadness into their marriage ceremony. So to keep that in my mind, while contracting that engagement which is life's chiefest business. Thus we may draw a sad but profitable moral from his funeral canal. Though the clergyman might have given his moral even a keener point, he did not fail to dispatch an attendant to inquire into the mystery, and stop those sounds, so dismally appropriate to such a marriage. A brief space elapsed, during which the silence was broken only by whisper and a few suspense tigers among the wedding party of spectators, who after the first shock were disposed to draw an ill-natured merriment from the air. The young have less charity for age fullest than old of the youth. The widow's glance has observed of wonder, for instance, towards a window of the church, as if searching for the time-worn marble that she had dedicated to her first husband. Then her eyelids dropped over their fade orbs, and her thoughts drew irritability to another grave. Two buoyant men, with a voice at her ear and a cry afar off, were calling her to lie down beside them. Perhaps, with momentary truth of feeling, she knew how much happier had been her fate, if after years of bliss, the bell were not tolling for her funeral, and she were followed to the grave by the all affection of her earliest lover, long her husband. But why had this returned to him? She dared call her shrunk from each other embraced. Still the death bell tolled is mournfully that the sunshine seemed to fade into the air. A whisper communicate from those who stood nearest the windows. Now, spreading through the church, a hearse, with a train of several coaches, was creeping along the street, conveying some dead man to the kirkyard, while the bride awaited a living one of the altar. Immediately after, the footstep of bridegroom and his friend were heard at the door. The widow looked down the aisle, and cleaned the arm of one her bridesmaid, in their bonny had with such unconscious violence, that the fair girl trembled. "You frighten me, my dear madam," cried she. "For heaven's sake, what is the matter?" "Nothing, my dear, nothing," said the widow. Then whispering close to her ear, "There is a foolish fancy that I cannot get rid of. I am expecting by my bridegroom to come into the church, with my first two husbands for groomsmen." "Look, look!" screamed the bridesmaid. "What is here?" "The funeral." As he spoke, a dark procession passed into the church. First came an old man and woman like chief mourners at funeral, attired from head to foot in the deepest black. All about their pale features of hoary hair, he leaning on a staff, and supporting her decrepit form his nerveless arm. Behind the peer another and another peer, as aged, as black, and mournful as the first. As they drew near, the widow recognized in every face some traits of former friends, long forgotten, but now returning, as if from their own graves, to warm her to prepare a shrub, or with purpose almost as unwelcome, to exhibit their wrinkles and infirmity, They claim her as their companion by the tokens of her own decay. Many a merry night had been danced with them, in youth and now, in joyless age. She felt that some wearer partner should request her hand, and all unite in a dance of death to the music of funeral bell. While this age mourners were fussing up the aisle, it was observed that from the pew to pew, the spectators shuddered with impressible await, as some object, he heard to concealed by the intervening figures, came full in sight. Many turned away their faces. Others kept a fixed and rigid stare, and the young girl giggled hysterically and fainted with the laughter of her lips. When the spectral procession approached the altar, each couple separated and slowly diverged, till in the center appeared a form that had worthily ushered in with all gloomy pomp the death knell and the funeral. It was the bridegroom in his shroud. No garb but that one grave could have beneath such a dead-like aspect. The eyes, indeed, had been wild glint spectacular lamp. All else was with the steam calmness which old men wear in a coffin. The corpse stood motionless, but dresses the widow of accents that seemed to melt in the clang of the bell, which is heavenly air while he spoke. "Come, my bride," said the pale lips. "The hearse is ready. The sexton hands waiting for us to the door of Tom. Let us be married, and then to our coffins." How small the widow's horror be represented! It gave her to grasp of a dead man's bride. Her youthful friends stood apart, shuddering at the mourners, and sovereign bridegroom, and herself. The wool scenes expressed by the strongest imaginary, the vain struggle of the glad vanities of this world, when opposed to age, infirmity, sorrow, and death, the away-struck silence was first broken by the clearly man. Mr. Elwood said, strongly yet without someone of authority, "You are not well. Your mind has been agitated by unusual circumstances in which you are placed. The ceremony must be deferred. As an old friend, let me entreat you to return home." "Home? Yes, but not without my bride," answered he, in the same hollow accent. "You deem his mockery perhaps madness. Had I decided my age and broken frame to scarlet and embroidered, had I forced my weary lips to smile at my dead heart, that might have been mockery or madness. But now, let young and old declare which of us has come higher without a wedding garment." And the bridegroom of the bride stepped forward of a ghostly pace, and stood beside the widow, contrasting the outful simplicity of his shroud with the glaze of glitter in which she had arrayed herself for his unhappy sin. None, he beheld them, could deny to the trembled strength of moral which his discovered intellect had contributed. "Cruel, cruel!" groaned the heart-stricken bride.